Chapter 1, Shut It, You're Too Loud. A moonless, windy night, a fine time for murder, for shady dealings, for clandestine trysts. Yet, Trent Manor and the Duke's Manor were ablaze with wedding festivities, red lanterns illuminating half of Brighton City. At the third watch, while Trent Manor's servants bustled with wedding preparations, Lillian Young and her maid, Hannah Doe, perched comfortably on the rafters of Charlotte Trent's room. With her legs tucked up, she spread open a blank-paged, blue-covered book. Charcoal pencil in one hand, she glanced down at Charlotte Trent, swiftly sketching her likeness. In her other hand, she held an apple, taking bites between strokes. 10 years had passed since she arrived in this world. From a young girl, she'd become a 20-year-old spinster. From a newcomer, she'd transformed into an old fox, living a life of leisure. Driven by the habits of her past profession, she'd separated from the wealthy young merchant family, establishing her own business, the Gentleman's Gazette, and igniting a whirlwind of gossip in this antiquated era. Duke Clarence was marrying. The flower had found its owner. Such a grand affair demanded a special feature, a portrait of Mrs. Clarence, to quell the infatuation of every maiden in the land. Crunch, crunch. The rhythmic sound of munching echoed from the rafters. Lillian Young ate contentedly, her pencil now stowed, Charlotte Trent's image clear on the page. Hannah Doe, beside her, frowned. "Miss, you're too loud. You've disturbed the occupants of the room." "Have I?" Lillian Young, dubious, glanced down. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Charlotte Trent and her maid had stopped, staring up at them warily. Lillian Young, abashed, stuck out her tongue. Looking at the apple core in her hand, she tossed it aside and bent her head, resuming her sketching, eager to return and print copies. "Miss, the master had another one of his episodes today. Matchmakers are swarming the manor for your portrait. Let me see, this is the..." Hannah Doe meticulously counted on her fingers. "This is the 309th time. Every time a young lady in the city gets married, the master gets anxious and rushes to marry you off. Miss, how do you bear it? We should find a way to stop this, to prevent the matchmakers from constantly trampling our doorstep. The steward has complained repeatedly about replacing the door so often. It's affecting the structural integrity of the gate. One day." "Shut it, you're too loud." Lillian Young shot Hannah Doe a look, scrutinizing her finished work. Something felt amiss. She leaned down for another look at her subject, intending to make some adjustments. Looking down, she was terrified. Chapter 2, Schemes and Ill Intentions. Red candles still flickered in the room, but the number of maids had dwindled. Only 3 or 4 remained, sprawled on the floor, motionless as corpses. Charlotte Trent was nowhere to be seen. Where has the young lady gone?" Hannah Doe gasped. Lillian Young, alarmed, swiftly descended from the rafters, Hannah Doe close behind. They each crouched beside a maid, checking for breath. Finding only the regular rhythm of slumber, they sighed in relief, rising to survey the room. Hannah Doe's sharp eyes spotted a letter on the table. She immediately retrieved it, presenting it to Lillian. "Miss, a letter." Lillian Young frowned, reading the note to discover Charlotte Trent had eloped with her lover. What now? Leave or stay? She pondered this deeply. Ah ha ha ha. A thought sparked, and Lillian Young laughed maniacally, her cunning and triumph uncontainable, her eyes gleaming with wicked intent. Fate offered a golden chance, her character exploded with opportunity. Access to 3 royal hotties, juicy gossip to mine. Excellent. Her Gentleman's Gazette would ignite the passions of maidens and matrons, silver flowing into her coffers like a river. Miss, your dribble is showing. How ghastly. Hannah Doe exclaimed, wiping Lillian's chin with a handkerchief. Lillian Young gripped Hannah Doe's hand, her eyes sparkling as she stared intently, making Hannah Doe tremble and stammer, Miss, what are you planning now? Usually, when Miss wore that look, trouble brewed. What scheme was she concocting this time? Hana-do, you have half an hour. Take this portrait back to the third young mistress. I need her to craft a face, Charlotte Trent's face. Make haste. Lillian Young thrust the freshly painted portrait into Hana-do's hands, snatched the bridal gown and phoenix crown from the bed, donned them, veiled herself, and sat excitedly, awaiting Sebastian Ward to whisk her away to his ducal manor. Watching her mistress's escalating mania, Hana-do felt like weeping but couldn't, utterly clueless about Lillian's intentions. After a stunned moment, she feebly asked, Miss, what are you doing? Why haven't you left? Half an hour is not much, plus the third young mistress's crafting time. It's tight. Oh, I'm such a fool. I've overlooked a crucial step. Hana-do, confine this girl to young estate, have her guarded. Then, tell the third young mistress to quickly make an identical face, and have her wear it. Lillian Young lifted her veil, casually selected a fainted maid, tossed her to Hana-do, shoved her out, and kicked her up to the roof. Satisfied, she clapped her hands, adjusted her attire, and returned to the bed for a nap. Chapter 3, Mercy, No More Torment. Awakened by a nudge, Lillian Young opened her eyes to an unfamiliar room. After a moment of disorientation, she saw Hana-do's sweaty face and jumped up joyfully. Did you bring it? Yes, Hana-do mumbled, nodding wearily, her eyes still holding a trace of misery. She pulled a box from her bosom and whispered, Miss, please, no more torment for Hana-do. The third young mistress was angry with you. Lillian Young took the box, opened it eagerly, and saw a gossamer thin mask. Pride swelled within her. This unique art of disguise, exclusive to the Young family's third young mistress, was always a marvel. Good that she was angry. The thing is, never mind, Miss wouldn't understand. Recalling the third young mistress's icy glare, Hana-do shivered, rubbed her arms, and began preparing Lillian's disguise. Hana-do. Lillian Young, watching Hana-do in the bronze mirror, gave a strained smile. There's something crucial you must do, urgent and vital. Hana-do's hand paused mid-stroke through her hair, a prickle of foreboding making her freeze. After a moment, she hesitantly asked, What is it? This and that, help me steal, no, borrow something. Lillian Young swallowed. Venomous Touch just concocted a new hypnotic, called Oblivion Draft. Help me borrow it, and get it here before the consummation. The eldest Mrs. Concoction. Hana-do's eyes widened in disbelief. Miss, you're asking for my head. No one has ever borrowed, let alone stolen, anything from the eldest Mississippi. We're different, she'll lend it to me. Lillian Young stuck out her tongue, her words lacking conviction. Within Young Estate, she feared no one but her eldest sister, Catherine Young, also known as Venomous Touch. The moniker Venomous Touch meant exactly that, a death so subtle, one wouldn't know until their body rotted. Stealing the draft was a 9 deaths 1 life gamble, but the draft was indispensable. The stand-in had to be flawless, the consummation couldn't fail. With the Oblivion Draft, she could hypnotize Duke Clarence and fabricate a convincing consummation scene. Miss, is it possible? It has to be. This draft is crucial. It determines whether we can infiltrate the Duke's manor, sneak into the royal palace, and gather all the juicy gossip. Hana-do, do this right, and regardless of success, your next month's wages are doubled, 8 bolts of cloud silk, and a half-month holiday. Chapter 4, I'm doomed, I get carsick. Enough, miss. Hana-do interrupted, thought for a moment, then gritted her teeth and agreed. Without another word, she turned and leaped out the west window. Once Hana-do was gone, the fainted maids and midwives in the room gradually came to, stirring in confusion. Seeing their mistress still present, they sighed in relief, exchanged puzzled glances, and resumed their wedding preparations. A maid helped Lillian Young to the vanity table, adding several pure gold hairpins to her elaborate hairstyle, nearly breaking her neck in the process. The flurry of activity continued until the first light of dawn, when the deafening crackle of firecrackers erupted outside. Lady Eleanor Trent arrived with her maids, clutching Lillian Young's small hand and weeping profusely, making Lillian's skin crawl. She wanted to throttle the woman. Thankfully, the matchmaker's urging finally got her into the palanquin. Inside the palanquin, Lillian Young breathed a sigh of relief, then heard the cheerful call, "Off we go." Her face instantly paled as she remembered something dreadful. "I'm doomed, I get carsick." The palanquin swayed all the way to the Duke's manor, leaving Lillian Young green and nauseous. The moment it stopped, she stumbled out, and before she could take 3 steps, a whoosh sounded beside her ear. A red arrow with pink tassels had pierced the palanquin door, sending her red veil fluttering in the morning breeze. Gasp! The surrounding crowd inhaled sharply in unison. "I'm dead, my stand-in act is about to be exposed." Panic seized Lillian Young. In her haste, one hand flew to her sleeve to shield her true face, while the other snatched up the veil to cover her head. "Wait, I'm in disguise, what am I panicking about?" Before she could fully relax, a gentle breeze stirred the red veil, revealing a pair of large men's feet before her eyes. Her throat constricted, a premonition of disaster gripped her, and with a sudden retch, she vomited. The foul-smelling filth promptly erupted onto the man's red coat and large feet, his outstretched hand freezing mid-air before slowly curling into a fist. Lillian Young, glancing up at the imposing fist, felt a chill down her spine. "Ah, apologies. I'm carsick." "Carsick?" The pleasant male voice sharpened, laced with icy disbelief. Yes, carsick. Truly. Those sedan chair carriers were utterly unprofessional, like wobbly-legged shrimps. The swaying was dreadful, it upset my stomach and brought up my supper. Lillian Young nodded vigorously, blaming the carriers while feigning nausea. Hashtag Chapter 5, Oops, Indecent Assault, The man's brow furrowed as he stepped back slightly, his tone softening, the iron fist unclenching. Crisis averted. Lillian Young and Hannah Doe simultaneously wiped away cold sweat. Heavens! The Duke's wedding finery is soiled. Quickly, assist the Duke back to change. The auspicious hour approaches, we cannot delay. The matchmaker, aghast at the mess on Sebastian Ward, shrieked orders to the Duke's manor servants. Spare wedding attire. Lillian Young, mortified to realize she'd vomited on Sebastian Ward, the Duke she was impersonating, blushed crimson. Truly, no need for such trouble. I don't mind the stain. A damp cloth will suffice. As for the odor, a few drops of rosewater should mask it. Delaying the auspicious hour would be most unfortunate. Instantly regretting her words, she cringed inwardly. She sounded desperate to be wed, like a lovesick maiden clinging to any man who'd have her. Do as she says. To her surprise, Sebastian Ward, after a brief pause, acceded to her suggestion. A servant hurried over with a golden, auspicious animal-shaped basin. Hannah Doe moved to take it, but Lillian Young, eager to atone, snatched the basin and rolled up her sleeves. Allow me. The soiled area on Sebastian Ward was rather delicate. Lillian Young's hand trembled as she held the cloth, blushing furiously. How mortifying. She hadn't noticed where she'd vomited until now. Should she dare to wipe there? Her gaze, flitting toward Sebastian Ward, took on a sudden, inappropriate boldness. Should she, or shouldn't she? Lillian Young's face burned as she clutched the cloth. Surely this didn't count as molestation. He was her husband in name, so a little touching and looking was permissible, right? After a fierce internal debate, she gritted her teeth, her face ablaze, and dabbed carefully at the mess on Sebastian Ward, avoiding the critical area. Sebastian Ward watched her ministrations with a detached amusement, secretly hoping she'd shriek upon encountering a man's most prized possession. When no shriek came, a flicker of disappointment crossed his features, his gaze turning colder. He'd known countless women, gentle, venomous, scheming, all tiresome. They all used their charms to acquire what they desired, men, possessions, power. This woman, Eleanor Trent's daughter, was merely a pawn in the Empress's game to weaken him. And then there were the infatuated, foolishly besotted women, coveting his looks with a shallowness that disgusted him most of all. What manner of woman is she? Chapter 6, Damn you, you're pushing your luck. Finally, the shoe was clean. Lillian Young stood, tossed the handkerchief into the golden basin, and clapped her hands briskly. Right, have someone fetch some rose oil to mask the scent. You missed a spot. Sebastian Ward smirked coldly, seizing her hand and pressing it to a particular location. The heat radiating through her bridal gown made Lillian Young snatch her hand back, her flushed face now crimson. Let go, you scoundrel, she spat. Isn't this what you lot crave? Sebastian Ward sneered in her ear, his gaze filled with disdain. Damn you, you're pushing your luck. Lillian Young stiffened, a look of disgust twisting her features. She yanked her hand back. Fine, I'll wipe it. See if I care. Don't come crying to me later. With that, she grabbed the handkerchief from the golden basin, foregoing wringing it out, and swiped a large, sopping wet section directly across his most sensitive area, twisting it with a vicious, vengeful intent. A groan escaped Sebastian Ward's lips, tinged with pain. He hadn't expected such audacity, such a brazen act in broad daylight. His earlier taunt now felt like a stinging slap in the face. The pain below, coupled with the humiliation, sent his handsome features through a kaleidoscope of color, black, white, then a sickly green. If he could, he would run her through with a sword. An awkward and bizarre silence descended, the air thick with tension. Countless eyes stared at Lillian Young, mouths agape, their thoughts screaming, the princess just molested the prince. Lady Doe, standing nearby, paled and muttered a prayer, dabbing at the cold sweat on her brow. Watching the open hostility between the prince and his not yet wedded princess, she feared they might come to blows right then and there. Quickly, the auspicious hour is upon us. Escort the bride to the Duke's manor for the ceremony. Thinking fast, the matchmaker seized Lillian Young and practically dragged her over the saddle, past the brazier, and into the main hall of the Duke's manor with the speed of a gale, thrusting the red silk threads into their hands. An awkward silence fell over the hall, the earlier commotion replaced by a hushed stillness. Seated upon his throne, the emperor frowned, his gaze falling upon the damp stain spreading across Sebastian Ward's robes. His face darkened. Did my son lose control of his bladder? The question echoed in the emperor's mind. The empress, seated beside him, glanced at the mortified Sebastian Ward, a subtle smirk playing on her crimson lips. A barely perceptible snort of contempt escaped her before she schooled her features into the benevolent mask of a mother to the world, her eyes sweeping the room, masking the flash of malice, as she gauged the emperor's reaction. Chapter 7, that was a ruthless move. The attending ministers shifted uncomfortably, sharing the emperor's unspoken question. Fortunately, they possessed greater composure, pointedly avoiding looking at Sebastian Ward's robes, feigning ignorance as they offered their congratulations. Snort, haha, a sudden burst of laughter, starting small and growing rapidly, filled the hall, causing everyone's faces to darken with a mixture of embarrassment and the urge to flee. My dear brother, it seems you're quite taken with her, even forgetting your thrice-folded fan. A handsome young lord emerged from the crowd, playfully fanning himself as he approached Sebastian Ward, whispering teasingly with a hint of smugness. Everyone knew him as Edward Ward, the most handsome man in the Northern Majesty royal family, titled the Jade Prince, and chosen as the most beautiful man in the Gentleman's Gazette. He could be considered half the reason for Lillian Young's livelihood, as she was the one behind the Gentleman's Gazette, and he was her favorite. Jade Prince Edward Ward. Lillian Young's heart bloomed with joy, her eyes sparkling as she tossed back her veil, eager to behold Edward Ward's true countenance. Quick as a flash, Sebastian Ward seized her hand, his brow furrowed in displeasure. He tightened his grip, practically crushing her bones, desperate to avoid further embarrassment. She had made him a laughingstock, displeasing his father and amusing the queen. This woman, he would kill her. He'd had enough of her antics for one day. Ouch! Lillian Young cried out, glaring at him through her veil. Humiliated, she lowered her hand, wincing as she tried to pull her other hand back. His grip was brutal. As her hand swelled and reddened, fury boiled within her, and she gritted her teeth, fighting back tears. Her cry of pain only seemed to encourage Sebastian Ward, who tightened his grip further, as if intending to break her hand. Only when he heard her gasp and protest did he loosen his hold slightly, though he didn't release her, silently warning her against further disruptions. His temper was vile. It was all her fault for misjudging him, bringing this trouble upon herself. Tears welled in Lillian Young's eyes as she regretted her impulsive decision. This stand-in marriage scheme offered no benefits, she hadn't gained anything but trouble and injuries. This time, she was truly in deep. Lillian Young's undignified cry darkened the Emperor's face. He cast a cold glance at the disrespectful young woman. He had never known the famously demure lady of Trent Manor to be so unseemly, disgracing the royal family. Fearing further incidents, he immediately signaled to the ceremonial officer. The officer, sweating profusely, silently acknowledged the command and announced in a loud voice, "First bow, to heaven and earth." Sebastian Ward, holding the red silk cord, slowly turned. Seeing her still standing motionless, he raised an eyebrow and yanked the cord, sharply kicking the back of her knee. Chapter 8, The second fright caught off guard, Lillian Young cried out as pain shot through her knee. The combined force of the yank and the kick sent her sprawling toward Sebastian Ward. Her heart leaped into her throat. In desperation, she twisted, landing against him, her arms clinging to his neck as she gasped, "That was close." As she drew near, Sebastian Ward caught a whiff of a clean, subtle fragrance, unlike the cloying perfumes of other women. It was faint and pleasant, and he found it surprisingly agreeable. The matchmaker, jolted back to her senses for the second time, rushed forward with a maid. Together, they propped up the disaster-prone new princess consort, forcing her to kneel. As they were forcing her to bow, the sounds of a scuffle erupted from outside, followed by several royal guards being flung into the hall, landing in a heap. Assassins! Protect the Emperor and Empress! With a thunderous roar, the first-rank minister Trai, leading a cohort of Imperial guards, surged forward, encircling the Emperor and Empress protectively, their gazes fixed warily on the entrance. Sebastian Ward's eyes, glacial and radiating a palpable killing intent, forced Lillian Young to retreat 3 steps, her mind buzzing with gossip. She speculated that the newcomer might be here to steal the bride, and the target could be her, or perhaps Sebastian Ward himself. The former scenario seemed unlikely, the latter, exceedingly probable. Rumor held that Sebastian Ward was averse to female companionship, leading her to suspect he might be receptive. The one stealing the bride must be his close confidant. Her subtle movements didn't escape Sebastian Ward's sharp gaze. His eyes locked onto the pouch at her hip, and with a flick of his wrist, a burst of energy pierced a large hole in it. Gasps. Astonishment rippled through the crowd, faces contorting in disbelief. Looking at the meager handful of beans, she gnashed her teeth in frustration. Chapter 9, The hunger of hatred glaring at the ruined pouch, she gritted her teeth and tossed a bean into her mouth, chewing with a decisive crunch. Turning to face Sebastian Ward, she glared daggers at him through her veil. The hunger of hatred, she would remember this. The crunch darkened Sebastian Ward's face, his fists clenching with an audible crack. He yearned to strike the woman before him dead, right then and there. The Empress, observing the scene, her eyes gleaming with calculation, mused to herself, she'd only known that Eleanor Trent had a remarkably accomplished daughter, skilled in all the arts, even possessing some medical knowledge, a rare gem. She herself had considered her as a potential consort for her imperial son. Had Eleanor Trent's position not been so insignificant, offering little benefit to her son's power, she would have already been welcomed into the East Palace. Today's events, however, cast doubt on the rumors. Marrying her to that little scoundrel Sebastian Ward, though, that could be advantageous. Her disruptive nature could sow chaos within the Duke's manor, ultimately benefiting her son. Sebastian Ward. Sebastian Ward. I won't let you marry another. I won't allow it. A frantic male voice, laced with 7 parts anger yet strangely melodious, echoed from the courtyard. That voice is rather pleasant. He must be a handsome young lord. Crunch. Lillian Young's eyes lit up as she tossed another handful of beans into her mouth. Excitement coursed through her as she looked expectantly towards the entrance, whispering with anticipation, "He's here, he's here. Duke Clarence's bosom friend has arrived. This scandalous love affair will be the talk of the town." An affair. The wife's at the door, cough, cough, cough. Overwhelmed, Lillian Young's almond eyes widened, her words catching in her throat as she choked on some mulberry seeds. "Sister-in-law, have some tea." Edward Ward, a comforting presence amidst the falling snow, offered a cup of bitter tea. Lillian Young gratefully accepted the tea, draining it in one gulp. Edward Ward solicitously patted her back, a concerned, "Don't drink so fast, you'll choke and break third brother's heart," escaping his lips. As he spoke, he cast a pointed glance at Sebastian Ward, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Pft. Cough, cough, cough. Bloody hell, never drink while someone's cracking jokes, did this bloke not know that? Lillian Young choked, spraying tea everywhere, her composure shattered. Jade King, that joke was ice cold. Having wasted half her tea, she finally dislodged the mulberry seed. Rolling her eyes, she rubbed her arms dramatically, feigning a chill. #### Chapter 10, Exquisitely Handsome Man. Ignoring Edward Ward, Lillian Young set down her cup, lifted her veil, and glanced towards the door. One look, and her vision expanded, her soul soothed. Exquisite, she declared, her assessment definitive. A man strode through the doorway, 8 feet tall, a jade crown atop his head. Clad in snow-white robes, his features were ethereal, almost indescribable. His narrow phoenix eyes held a flicker of anger as he advanced, a 7-foot sword in hand. It was him, the man who belonged on the cover of this month's Gentleman's Gazette. Sales would surely skyrocket. But who was he? Why had she never heard of him before? A chill permeated the air. Lillian Young felt a sudden drop in temperature. Startled, she turned to Sebastian Ward, taking him in at close proximity for the first time. He was dressed in fiery red robes, his raven hair bound with a purple-gold band. Tall and straight as a pine, his face was like a blossoming peach tree, his eyebrows sharp as knives against his temples. His hawk-like eyes were piercing and deep, his nose straight and proud, his full lips slightly parted in a way that was both alluring and sensual. An exquisitely handsome man. The sketch she'd made of him, a fleeting glimpse through a crack in the door as he hurried past, had captured only 7/10 of his magnificence. Now, seeing him in full, he seemed even more handsome than the Jade King, Edward Ward, with an added masculine aura that made him all the more imposing. She'd struck gold. Lillian Young's initial shock morphed into delight. She beamed at Sebastian Ward, a goofy grin spreading across her face. Her gaze was so intense that Sebastian Ward turned, their eyes locking. He was captivated, lost in her stare. It took a moment for him to regain his composure and face the approaching, irate man in white. If he was this handsome, the other two must be equally striking. Lillian Young switched into work mode, her gaze flitting to Edward Ward. She'd seen Edward Ward before, another fleeting glimpse, albeit a rather scandalous one. That summer, seeking information, she'd snuck into the Emerald Duke's residence. The residence had a crystal-clear lake, the water quality excellent, she'd have to swim there sometime. She'd spied on Edward Ward. The man had a superb physique, more delicate than a woman's. Her nose burning, something trickling down, Lillian Young instinctively reached up to touch it, bringing her hand before her eyes. Her small face flushed crimson. Overwhelmed with excitement, she'd actually thought about Edward Ward to the point of a nosebleed. 2 streams of blood flowed down her nose, provoking Sebastian Ward. He turned, walked to her side, gave Edward Ward an icy glance, then wiped the blood from her face, coldly asking, "What is this?" Chapter 11, a heart full of resentment, a nosebleed. Even a fool knows that. Lillian Young blurted out, then realized her blunder, embarrassedly dropping her hand and lowering her veil, feigning ignorance. Humph. Sebastian Ward grunted heavily, his gaze cold and menacing. Even through the veil, she felt the pressure. Lillian Young shuddered, feigning a smile. "I'm delicate, easily overwhelmed by tonics. It must be the supplements Mother gave me last night. Too much nourishment, hence the nosebleed. No need for alarm." She wouldn't admit to seeing Edward's actions, not even if it killed her. The consequences would be dire. Sebastian Ward knew she was lying. Displeased, he warned in a low voice, "From now on, your eyes may only see this king. Otherwise, death." Sebastian Ward had never spoken such words to any woman. The intensity of his possessiveness surprised even him, but he showed no sign of it. Oh. What did that mean? Lillian Young didn't quite understand. "Whose death?" she asked. "Everyone's." The reply was chilling. A wave of cold washed over Lillian Young. She shivered, asking weakly, "No room for negotiation?" He answered her with a frigid stare. "So cold." Lillian Young shivered, resentment blooming in her heart. The rumors were true. Duke Clarence Sebastian Ward, though handsome, was a cold-hearted devil. He wasn't someone to trifle with. Retreating and preserving her freedom was paramount. She'd memorized his features, sketching him for the Gentleman's Gazette would bring in plenty of coin without risking her life and happiness. As for his nude portrait, she could always improvise. "Sebastian Ward, you intend to be a faithless scoundrel." The ignored, white-clad beauty challenged, sword in hand, its tip aimed at Sebastian Ward's throat. This action, these words, instantly captured Lillian Young's attention, igniting her gossipy soul, but darkened everyone else's faces. Even the Emperor, who'd eaten more salt than rice, broke out in a cold sweat, his expression grim. Sebastian Ward's face darkened, his gaze fixed coldly on the white-clad beauty. The atmosphere grew still and oppressive. No one spoke, all eyes on the 2 men. Something was wrong. Where was the expected drama, the smoldering gazes? There was nothing. Lillian Young was bewildered, disappointed. Damn it, the more she looked, the less the beautiful man seemed like he was there to interrupt the wedding. "Li Ni, lower your sword." The Emperor, silent for a long while, suddenly spoke. His imperial authority, majestic and awe-inspiring, instantly quelled the room. Chapter 12, Brother, you've killed the wrong man. Lillian Young looked at the white-clad beauty with suspicion. She recalled a long-held royal secret. The Emperor had 6 sons. The Crown Prince wasn't the eldest. The second son, Nicholas Ward, had been appointed Crown Prince. Duke Clarence Sebastian Ward and Nicholas Ward were brothers, but not born of the Empress. They were sons of noble consort Xiao. 3 years ago, Nicholas Ward had been deposed, and the eldest son, Daniel Ward, made Crown Prince. Nicholas Ward was now confined to the palace. "Brother, your second Prince Nicholas Ward?" Lillian Young's eyes lit up, gazing joyfully at Nicholas Ward, completely oblivious to the murderous aura surrounding Sebastian Ward. Nicholas Ward paid her no mind, his gaze fixed on Sebastian Ward, seemingly awaiting his response. "Brother, you've caused enough chaos." Sebastian Ward replied. Coldly, 2 fingers pinching the blade as he slowly moved it away from his throat. "Is this your answer?" Nicholas Ward laughed, not in anger, but with a hint of sorrowful mockery. "Ha ha ha ha. I misjudged you." She misplaced her affections. Sebastian Ward, you are not worthy of her. I won't kill you, I want you to regret this, regret it for the rest of your life." With that, Nicholas Ward turned the blade in his hand, thrusting it towards Lillian Young, who stood to his right and slightly behind him. Big brother, you've got the wrong person." Lillian Young, startled, stunned for half a second, quickly tilted her head to the right as the blade grazed her ear, severing several pearl strands on her phoenix crown. Clatter, the pearls scattered on the ground. The first strike having missed, Nicholas Ward flipped his wrist, the long sword thrusting straight towards Lillian Young's heart, a clean, decisive move without hesitation. What was happening? What had she said to be pursued like this? Terror seized Lillian Young. Seeing the sword aimed at her heart, she stood dumbfounded, mouth agape, unable to react. Only when the tip touched her chest did she snap back to reality, lightly tapping her toe and using the momentum to fly backward. Unexpectedly, her foot slipped on the scattered pearls, and instead of retreating, she propelled herself towards the blade. Her face paled, and she closed her eyes in despair. Gasp! Everyone inhaled sharply, the air thick with the coppery tang of blood. The blade surely must have pierced her chest, but no. Lillian Young hesitantly opened her eyes. The tip of the sword hovered half an inch from her chest, a large hand gripping the blade, crimson drops of blood staining it. Lillian Young stared at Sebastian Ward in astonishment, her throat constricting. She choked back a sob before managing, "You're hurt." Chapter 13, Affection, Different Treatment. Sebastian Ward's gaze didn't meet hers, nor did he acknowledge her words. His eyes were locked on Nicholas Ward, unwavering and resolute, devoid of warmth. Nicholas Ward trembled, spurred by the sight of blood. "You'd rather be injured for her sake, why?" "Yes, why?" Lillian Young also awaited an answer. Sebastian Ward remained silent. The Emperor, beside himself with rage, slammed his palm onto a tea table, shattering it. "Someone, escort the second prince back to the palace for punishment." At his command, a group of guards immediately surrounded Nicholas Ward. The lead guard announced, "Second prince, forgive us," before carefully taking Nicholas Ward's arm, withdrawing the sword, and half forcing him away from the Duke's manor. Helpless, Nicholas Ward looked back at Sebastian Ward, then at Lillian Young, until he was escorted out of the courtyard, his figure disappearing from sight. Lillian Young's heart pounded as if struck. She sensed a rift between Sebastian Ward and Nicholas Ward, caused by a woman. A pang of unease settled within her, intensifying as she saw Sebastian Ward's injured hand. "Let's bandage this first, stopping the bleeding is more important." As she spoke, Lillian Young retrieved a pale blue silk cloth and a porcelain jar of healing ointment from her bodice, tending to his wound. She bandaged him carefully and gently. Sebastian Ward watched silently, his eyes falling upon the corner of the silk embroidered with the word "Young," the depths of his gaze suddenly turning icy. She wasn't Charlotte Trent. After she finished bandaging him, the Emperor, favorably impressed and treating her differently, commanded the officiating minister, "Perform the ceremony. First bow to heaven and earth, bow." The minister, receiving the Emperor's decree, dreamily drawled the familiar words. Lillian Young was supported on both sides by the wedding matron and a maid. The maid seemed familiar, her scent elegant and recognizable, prompting Lillian to inhale deeply. Suddenly, the fragrance morphed into the cloying sweetness of lilies. Blasted, hit by venomous touch. Lillian Young's strength drained away, leaving her limp as mud, about to collapse, saved only by the two supporting her from kissing the ground. "Jasper, so glad to see you married. We've all come to witness the ceremony. Your dowry is mixed in with the gifts, be sure to check carefully. Of course, there's also the marriage contract you signed." The smug voice echoed in her ears, striking Lillian Young like a thunderbolt. Chapter 14, Run, Run Fast. She'd been tricked. Venomous touches, we undoubtedly referred to the entire Young family, and that marriage contract, bearing the official seal, lacked only the groom's name. If it fell into Sebastian Ward's hands, becoming legally binding, she'd want to die. She had to escape, and quickly. Before she could lament, she was forcefully pressed to her knees by two people, her forehead touching the ground, bowing to heaven and earth, then bowing as husband and wife. Then the minister loudly proclaimed, "To the bridal chamber." Utterly bewildered, she was received by the impassive Sebastian Ward, who took her from the wedding matron and personally escorted her away. Upon reaching the chamber, Sebastian Ward dismissed all the attending maids, closing the door to be alone with her. Hearing the rhythmic footsteps receding, a chill gripped Lillian Young. The heavy thud of the closing door echoed like a death knell, nearly suffocating her, leaving her anxiously anticipating Sebastian Ward's bestial urges to devour her. "Ah! What are you doing?" Suddenly swept into Sebastian Ward's arms, her small face pressed against his firm chest, her heart pounded erratically. Rip! With a sudden sound, her vision brightened as Sebastian Ward tore off the red veil, letting it flutter gently to the floor. Lillian Young, pale and astonished, stared at the handsome face close to hers, stammering, "It's still early, we shouldn't consummate, it would sully reputations. There are still guests, waiting for you to raise a toast, you must attend to them." Sebastian Ward paused, speechless, merely gazing at her as he slowly lowered her onto the wedding bed, his body gradually leaning over her, his heavy breaths warming her face. Lillian Young inhaled the faint, alluring scent emanating from him, her mind clouding, the deer in her heart leaping wildly, she gradually succumbed to his presence. Seeing her half-closed eyes masking her tension, Sebastian Ward chuckled softly, reaching out to take her wrist and check her pulse. Waiting, but seeing no untoward actions from him, Lillian Young was surprised, a flicker of disappointment in her heart. When he took her pulse, she understood, he knew she was poisoned. A touch of warmth bloomed within her, a strange affection taking root, buried deep within her heart. It's useless. No one can undo her poison. It's not lethal, just induces a 6-hour sleep. Lillian Young blushed, tucking her hand into her sleeve to hide her nervousness. "Charlotte Trent." Sebastian Ward withdrew his hand, probingly calling her name. #### Chapter 15, Unease Stirs, It Is I. Lillian Young hesitated slightly as she replied. Sebastian Ward observed her every expression as he questioned her. That slight hesitation confirmed his suspicion, she wasn't Charlotte Trent. The silk used for bandaging, the unexpected inner strength he felt when checking her pulse, all pointed to her not being Charlotte Trent. The real Charlotte Trent didn't know martial arts and possessed a gentle, yielding nature, unlike this woman's wild, untamed spirit. The silk was embroidered with the character, Young, the rare illusion cloud brocade. Besides the immensely wealthy Young family, he couldn't think of anyone else who possessed it. Was she a young lady from the Young family? Recently, rumors circulated about the Young family secretly selling weapons and horses to the southern Thuong nation, raising suspicions of collusion with the enemy. Had she infiltrated the Duke's manor to gather intelligence? "Why are you looking at me like that?" His gaze was too cold, sharp as a newly honed sword, making Lillian Young uneasy and afraid in his presence. Sebastian Ward said nothing, withdrawing his gaze and rising to leave. He summoned 2 maidservants to attend to her, then didn't step foot in the bridal chamber again, likely going out to drink with the others. Once he was gone, Lillian Young breathed a sigh of relief, secretly rejoicing. She wanted to take advantage of his absence to find a way to escape. Although she'd been hit with her elder sister's limping powder, immobilizing her. Calculating the time, Hana-do should be coming to find her soon. Before that, she had to devise a way to subtly dismiss or incapacitate the two maids in the room so she could disappear unnoticed. "Miss, where are you? Speak of the devil and she shall appear, but perhaps a little too loudly." Such boisterousness in another's manner seemed rather audacious. Now there was no other way. With Hana-do's booming voice, it was likely the entire Duke's manor had heard. Lillian Young was filled with regret, regretting that she hadn't agreed to swap maids with her close friend years ago. With a dark cloud of frustration hanging over her, Lillian Young used all her strength to yell, "Stop shouting. I'm in the second room on your right." The maids in the room were startled, rushing towards the bed. The Duke had instructed them to watch over the new Duchess. If anything happened, they were to face him personally. With a loud crash, the west-facing window of the room was shattered, the entire frame flying inwards and striking the two Duke's manor maidservants who were rushing forward. The scene, both terrifying and comical, left Lillian Young, lying on the bed, stunned. "Miss, I've brought the things. Haven't you consummated the marriage yet? Am I in time?" Hana-do tumbled through the window, momentarily dazed before regaining her composure. Looking up, she saw the bride in her bridal gown lying on the bed and frowned, slightly taken aback. #### Chapter 16, Assassin. "You're just in time, but also late. Hana-do, get me out of here." Lillian Young looked at Hana-do wearily, then froze. "Hana-do, your mouth, it's nothing. Compared to my life, this is fortunate. Eldest Miss said the pain and itching will be gone in a day." Hana-do, her mouth swollen like a sausage, casually walked to the bedside and handed her the bottle of fake liquor she'd procured. "No need for this, get me out of here." Lillian Young gave a strained smile. "Why leave? Aren't we supposed to infiltrate?" Before Hana-do could finish, a clamor of shouts erupted from the courtyard, loud as thunder. "Quickly, assassins have infiltrated the Duke's manor. Assassins in the Duke's manor, the Duchess has been kidnapped, quickly summon the Duke." Chaos descended upon the Duke's manor. The front courtyard buzzed with cheerful toasts and laughter, while the back courtyard erupted in pandemonium, swords drawn and guards rushing towards the bridal chamber to apprehend the assassins. Lillian Young looked at Hana-do in exasperation. This wasn't the first time Hana-do had brought trouble upon them. "Miss, what do we do? They're all coming. Hana-do isn't an assassin, and she didn't kidnap the Duchess." Hana-do's eyes reddened, tears welling up, looking utterly pitiful. "Hana-do, if you don't want to be hacked to pieces, carry me and run." Lillian Young, massaging her temples, addressed the witless girl who had clearly lost her senses. "Oh." Hana-do, finally snapping back to reality, scrambled onto the bed, hoisted her mistress onto her shoulders, and bolted through the already broken west window. Knocking over 2 or 3 of the Duke's guards, she clambered onto the roof and made her clumsy escape. "The assassins have taken the Duchess. Protect the Duchess." Someone's shout ignited the protective loyalty of the Duke's guards, and a swarm of them ascended onto the rooftops, pursuing Hana-do with drawn swords, yelling as they ran. Hana-do, having never witnessed such a scene, paled with fear. Miss, they're after us. What do we do?" "Oh, wait, why are we running? Didn't you say we were supposed to infiltrate the Duke's manor?" Hana-do's sudden stop made Lillian Young anxious. She urged her on. "Hana-do, a moment longer and we'll have swords at our throats. Even a fool knows when to choose her battles. Run." Hana-do, lips pursed, saw the pursuers closing in. Knowing they were out of time, she decided to postpone questioning her mistress. She quickly pulled out one of her mistress's homemade smoke bombs and hurled it into the crowd. Amidst the coughs and curses rising from the red smoke, she carried her mistress and escaped the Duke's manor. Hashtag Chapter 17, Fragrant Weakening Powder. The Youngs had too many eyes on them, the city was no place to linger. After escaping the Duke's manor, Lillian Young instructed Hannah Do to leave Brighton City and flee to the western hills, taking refuge in the treetop dwelling she had built while painting deep within the hills. The location was incredibly secluded, no one but she and Hannah Do could find it. The tree dwelling was built on a cliff face, the entrance hidden behind wild vines and green grapes that obscured a treacherous path. Beyond the path, around the back of the cliff, stood a giant pine tree. The small dwelling, perched high in the pine, commanded a view of the entire western hills. Should anyone approach, she would see them instantly and have ample time to escape. Lillian Young leaned against the window, gazing down at the verdant landscape below. The gentle mountain breeze dispelled the summer heat, easing her mind. She had no immediate plans to return, intending to wait 6 hours for the potion's effects to wear off, and then, after the release of the 43rd issue of the Gentleman's Gazette at the end of the month, she would return to settle accounts with those old foxes. "Miss, were you hit with the first Mrs. Fragrant Weakening Powder?" Hannah Do leaned closer, looking at her with concern. She'd been busy escaping and hadn't noticed the Mrs.'s condition until now, when they had a moment to breathe. Lillian Young nodded, languidly pulling her sketchbook from her bodice and handing it to Hannah Do. "Don't worry, the effects wear off in 6 hours. Take these sketches back, the publication date is approaching, we can't delay. Tell the little bees I won't be at the Snow Aroma Pavilion this month. Let them choose their own subjects. But miss, I'm not comfortable leaving you alone on the mountain. You're like a newborn babe right now, anyone could crush you. If you encounter a wild beast, you'll be bones." Hannah Do flipped through the sketches again, her gaze lingering on Charlotte Trent's portrait. "Miss, there's something." "What is it?" Lillian Young absently touched her face, annoyed to find it seemed to have merged with her own, impossible to remove by external force. It seemed she'd have to seek the third young mistress's help. Hannah Do shook her head, biting back her words. Suddenly remembering the antidote to the fragrant weakening powder she carried, she happily untied the fragrant pouch at her hip. Rummaging through it, she pulled out a small blue bottle with a white neck, considered it carefully, then offered it. "Miss, I have the antidote to the fragrant weakening powder. Drink it. Then I can go down the mountain with peace of mind." Hashtag Chapter 18, Truly Too Wicked to a Sister. Medicine. Lillian Young looked suspiciously at the bottle in Hannah Do's hand, hesitant to drink it. Hannah Do's things were not to be consumed lightly, she'd learned that lesson. "How did you get the antidote?" Lillian Young took the bottle but didn't drink, turning it over in her hands. "I accidentally stumbled into the first Miss's alchemy room last time and was hit with the powder. The first Miss gave it to me specifically." Hannah Do spoke with a hint of fear, clearly still shaken by the experience. "Venomous touch gave it to you?" Lillian Young gripped the bottle tighter, her hesitation growing. "Have you taken it?" Hannah Do nodded. The pill was slightly sweet, like candy, with a faint scent of osmanthus. "After taking it, did you feel any discomfort, or anything strange appear? Like, say, any part of you starting to rot?" Lillian Young asked, anxiously lifting Hannah Do's clothes to examine her body. Thankfully, there were no signs of poisoning. After confirming this with her own eyes, Lillian Young poured out a pill and swallowed it. The taste was different. It wasn't sweet like candy with the scent of osmanthus as Hannah Do described. Instead, it was slightly bitter, followed by sweetness, and the fragrance was of roses. "Hannah Do, are you sure it was sweet, like candy?" Lillian Young's face was pale and serious, a sense of foreboding washing over her. "It was sweet." Hannah Do nodded emphatically. The pill dissolved the moment it entered her mouth, too late to spit out. Lillian Young felt a mixture of amusement and exasperation. She swore never to consume anything from Hannah Do again, especially antidotes. She hoped what she'd just swallowed wasn't some incurable poison. Venomous touch, you're truly too wicked to your sister. Venomous touch's poison was all about speed and potency. Its effects were swift. In less than half a cup of tea's time, Lillian Young felt a burning heat spread through her, a fire igniting in her lower abdomen and quickly consuming her limbs. A clawing sensation tormented her insides, leaving her restless and filled with a desperate yearning for release. The moment the effects hit, she suspected what poison she'd been given. Though she resisted the thought, the truth was undeniable: she'd been tragically afflicted with an aphrodisiac, a poison too shameful to name. "Hana-do, I've been poisoned," Lillian Young choked back the rest of the sentence, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Hana-do. Her hands clutched her dress, teeth gritted against the rising tide of sensation. Her face flushed crimson, a blush that even her human skin mask couldn't conceal. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her breath coming in ragged gasps punctuated by the occasional strange moan. Her wedding dress lay discarded, leaving her in only a white chemise. She leaned halfway out the window, seeking a cooling breeze. Her long, dark hair billowed around her, resembling a black cloud clinging to the mountainside. #### Chapter 19, Get Me a Man. Alarmed by Lillian's state, Hana-do rushed to her side. "Miss, how were you poisoned? What can we do?" I'll go find the eldest miss." Panic seized Hana-do. Without a clear plan, her only thought was of Catherine Young's advanced medical knowledge. She turned and hurried down the mountain to seek her help. "Hana-do, don't go to her. She can't help with this poison." Lillian Young gripped Hana-do's arm, her voice weak. "It's an aphrodisiac, there's no antidote. Hana-do, I trust your judgment. Go, find a man down the mountain and bring him here." Venomous touch's aphrodisiac was 100 times stronger than common varieties. The only cure was intercourse, otherwise, the victim's blood vessels would burst, leading to death. She knew this wasn't the time for modesty, survival was paramount. If she could, she wished she were still at the Duke's manor. Then Sebastian Ward could help her. They'd perform the wedding rites. He was her husband in name. Importantly, he wasn't unattractive, and his appearance was to her liking. Giving him her first time wouldn't be so unpleasant. "Miss," Hana-do understood the implication, tears of distress streaming down her face. "Go quickly. In an hour, whether you find a man or not, you must return. If heaven wills my death, bury me properly and take me back to Young Estate. Let that old man condemn." Venomous touch. Even facing this dire situation, Lillian Young's thirst for revenge remained unquenched. "But miss, a woman's virtue be damned. If you dawdle any longer, you'll be picking up my corpse." Lillian Young snapped, cutting Hana-do off with a grimace. The old ways were rigid. Though she valued her virtue, her life was at stake. She had to choose the lesser of two evils. Hana-do looked at her with worry, then, biting her lip, ran out of the wooden tower. As she left, she threw back a shocking declaration: "I'll find Andy Bloom." Andy Bloom? At the name, Lillian Young's head throbbed. She turned towards the window and, despite her waning strength, yelled, "Hana-do, anyone but Andy Bloom. If you bring him, I'll bite my tongue off and die right here." What a jest! Andy Bloom, a rake flitting through a garden of delights, touching not a single petal, a scoundrel devoid of principle. Even if he were handsome, elegant, and smitten with her, even with prior intentions of marriage, she absolutely could not offer herself to him. But Hana-do departed too swiftly, not fully catching her words. Watching the vibrant green figure skip and dance upon the hill, a frost settled upon her heart. She lowered her gaze, then looked to the heavens and cried, "Oh, heavens, grant me a man." Chapter 20, Damn it, setting herself ablaze. The choked cry echoed through the mountains, startling the birds and mortifying the Duke's manor guards 5 miles away. Sebastian Ward, trailing behind, his face dark as a stovetop, his eye twitching incessantly, only recovered from the world-shaking exclamation after a considerable time. He turned to glare at the guards behind him. His gaze, sharp with a murderous intent, made them flinch, cursing their luck for stumbling upon this embarrassing moment between the Duke and Duchess. "Your Grace, the mountain winds are strong, we heard nothing. Men, let's disperse." Truyen Kung, the Duke's close confidant, feigned ignorance, chuckling as he addressed his subordinates, signaling them to make a swift retreat. "Your Grace, we take our leave." Thankfully, his brothers understood the cue, echoing Truyen Kung's farewell to Sebastian Ward, turning to flee down the mountain with the speed of cheetahs. In a flash, they were gone, leaving Sebastian Ward alone at the foot of the cliff, his face thunderous. The treehouse was secluded. Sebastian Ward searched beneath the cliff for some time, but found no path. The drug's effects intensified, causing Lillian Young to moan in agony, shedding her clothes and leaning against the window for air. Her moans, growing in intensity, mingled with the wind and carried down the cliff face. Sebastian Ward, with his keen hearing, caught her cries of pain. His expression shifted, and he grasped a vine, ascending the cliff, following the sound to the treehouse hidden behind the rocks. Before the treehouse window, her long black hair cascaded down her back, her white shoulders partially exposed, her skin as pale as snow. The sight parched his throat and ignited a fire in his belly. Lillian Young's voice was soft and alluring, her eyes hazy as she leaned out the window, staring at him. Damn it! She'd been drugged with an aphrodisiac. Sebastian Ward's eyes darkened. He leaped into the treehouse, the open door revealing the scene within. Fury ignited within him, and he cursed in a low voice, "Damned woman, do you know you're playing with fire?" If he hadn't arrived first, another man would have seen her like this. The thought enraged him, making him want to seize her and thrash her soundly. Lillian Young, ravaged by the aphrodisiac, had lost all reason. Only the word "man" remained in her thoughts. Her eyes, clouded with desire, couldn't focus. Apart from her hearing, her senses were dulled. Sebastian Ward's voice brought a spark of clarity. Instinctively, she lunged at him, crying out joyfully, "Heaven has answered my prayers. A man has fallen from the sky." #### Chapter 21, Why You? Get someone else. Sebastian Ward, pinned beneath her, watched in astonishment as she tore at his clothes, sloppily kissing his face, nipping and sucking at his nose, covering it with saliva. Finally, she found his lips, capturing them with a fierce bite, her movements rough, devoid of any tenderness. Ugh! Sebastian Ward gasped, a metallic tang of blood filling his mouth as he bit his tongue in pain. Lillian Young's kisses trailed down to his collarbone, nipping and biting with a ferocity that made Sebastian Ward frown. He, a man of tradition, found her forwardness unsettling, reminiscent of the courtesans in pleasure houses. Charlotte Trent. Sebastian Ward pushed the clinging figure away, attempting to rouse her. Through the haze of passion, Lillian Young heard him murmur another woman's name. A flash of annoyance crossed her face as she snapped, "Don't say her name." She punctuated her words with two sharp bites on his left shoulder. Sebastian Ward paused, then. A satisfied smile spread across his face, noting her sudden docility. His hawk-like eyes softened, yet burned with desire. With a swift movement, he rolled over, pinning her beneath him. Disoriented by the shift in position, Lillian Young furrowed her brow, pushing against his chest. "Don't say her name," she insisted. "Call me Jasper." "No, not like that old codger." Sebastian Ward's patience wore thin. He silenced her rambling with a kiss, his hand gripping her slender waist, reveling in the silken feel of her skin. Wait, let me finish." Lillian Young gasped, struggling against his embrace. "Call me Jasper," she insisted, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Jasper, my heart's delight." "Quiet, you're being far too loud." Sebastian Ward frowned, his lips sealing hers to stifle her words. Ow. You. Lillian Young's eyes flew open, the pain clearing her head. She stared at Sebastian Ward, then erupted, why you? I asked for someone else. You're not gentle at all. Someone else? Never speak of such a thing again, or I'll rid myself of every man who dares to come near you. Sebastian Ward's face darkened as he delivered a sharp smack to her bottom. Humiliated, Lillian Young's face flushed crimson. Curse you, you bloody dog. Touch me again and I'll make a eunuch of you. Jasper, my heart's delight. Sebastian Ward gritted out, his voice a mixture of tenderness and exasperation. Taken aback by his endearment, Lillian Young blinked, the sting of the earlier slap fading. We're having a serious conversation, she stated firmly. We are always conversing, and I am always serious. Sebastian Ward refused to let her words dampen his ardor, silencing her with a deep, consuming kiss. Hurry up, Our Lady is waiting. Their passionate interlude was interrupted by Hannah Doe's voice, echoing from outside the room, growing closer with each word, the rustle of her approaching form audible even from afar. Hannah Doe. Lillian Young shoved Sebastian Ward away, rubbing her forehead in exasperation, sighing once more at her foolish maid. That girl always had a knack for ruining things. Hearing someone approach the treehouse, Sebastian Ward rolled Lillian into the plush bed, his large hand snatching the wedding dress to cover her body. Finally, he casually draped the torn bridal gown over himself, pulled her close, and waited for the unwelcome visitor, his face darker than a thundercloud. Outside the treehouse, Hannah Doe led Andy Bloom to the door and reached to push it open. Andy Bloom stopped her with his folding fan and tossed her a bag of sweets, teasing, "Silly girl, you don't understand these matters between a man and a woman. Take these cakes and wait down by the cliff." Hannah Doe's eyes widened as she remembered something, blushing as she nodded. Clutching the treats, she said anxiously, "Then you go in, be gentle, don't hurt Mississippi. And also, be careful, it'll make babies." She'd heard that a woman's first time was painful, Miss had mentioned it during a sex education lesson. The thought of pain made Hannah Doe's brow furrow with worry for her mistress. Andy Bloom looked at Hannah Doe in surprise, then nodded dumbly. "All right." Reassured, Hannah Doe turned and left. Their entire conversation was overheard by those inside. Had Sebastian Ward not confirmed her virginity with his own eyes, he would have mistaken her for a wanton woman. Sebastian Ward's face darkened. Glancing at the crimson stain on the floor, he asked, "What have you been teaching her?" Mortified, Lillian Young wanted the earth to swallow her whole. His question deepened her blush. "And nothing much, just a little, sex education. Hannah Doe is so naive, I was afraid she'd be taken advantage of, so I gave her a bit of a primer." Darling. The joyous call abruptly cut off. Andy Bloom froze like a statue, staring at the amorous couple in the treehouse, his face burning. He spun around and stormed out. "That damned Hannah Doe. I apologize for interrupting your activities. Please, continue." "Well, what's this then?" Lillian Young stared at the retreating figure, a thought flashing through her mind. She remembered she was wearing another woman's face. After a moment's pause, a plan formed. Feigning terror, she cried out, "Andy, help me. Save me. He's trying to force himself on me. Save me, Andy darling." How sickeningly sweet. Lillian Young cringed internally, her stomach churning. Sebastian Ward's face hardened, his grip tightening around her as he glared at Andy Bloom's retreating back. A thought flashed through his mind, if that man turned around, he would kill him. Hearing the familiar voice, Andy Bloom turned back to Lillian Young, his eyes questioning. Recognizing the mischievous glint in her eyes, but uncertain about the face, he asked, "Darling? Is that you?" Ignoring Sebastian Ward's murderous glare, Lillian Young nodded vigorously, putting on a pitiful act like a frightened rabbit. "It's me, darling." Andy Bloom's face drastically changed, like a whirlwind. He rushed to the bedside. Without a word, he raised the folding fan in his hand and slashed toward Sebastian Ward, who was tearing at the garments, his eyes bloodshot, roaring, "You bastard, you dare touch my woman, I'll castrate you into a eunuch." The scolding, identical to hers, irritated Sebastian Ward. Killing intent surged within him as he rolled over and leaped up, striking a direct palm blow at Andy Bloom's head. As the two men fought, locked in an even match, Lillian Young, left unattended, ignored them. She walked straight to the western corner, retrieved a jade-green garment from a rosewood chest, pulled down the tablecloth to create a makeshift screen, and hid within to change. Just as she finished dressing, Lillian Young heard a slap from beyond the curtain. Curious, she peeked through, witnessing Andy Bloom being sent flying by a single palm strike from Sebastian Ward, sailing out the wide-open doorway. #### Chapter 22, All Talk, No Bite. Is this the extent of a legendary expert? All talk, no bite. So weak. Lillian Young gritted her teeth and sighed, raising her middle finger towards the door, utterly disdainful of the boastful Andy Bloom. It seemed escaping Sebastian Ward would require a different approach. "Ah, Master Bloom, why are you outside? Has Miss been detoxified?" Hannah Doe's surprised voice rang out from beyond the room. One to deliver, one to receive at the door, Hannah Doe joyfully ran in, her eyes only for Lillian Young. She threw herself into her arms, weeping with joy. "Miss, it's so wonderful, your poison has been cured." "But, Miss, Hannah Doe will inform the master and the young masters, the other misses." "Inform them for what?" Lillian Young didn't understand. Hannah Doe cast a disdainful glance, stating the obvious, "Naturally, so they can prepare for your marriage." As they spoke, Andy Bloom, having returned for her sake, overheard Hannah Doe's words. He nodded in agreement, praising Hannah Doe's understanding. "Hannah Doe is right, when the time comes for the wedding, I'll certainly give you a large red envelope. Take your miss outside to a safe place, I'll deal with him and then we'll return together to prepare for the wedding." Hannah Doe only then noticed another person in the room, and a man at that. She was momentarily speechless, staring wide-eyed at Sebastian Ward, stammering, You. Miss, you too. He is he, I am I, there's no, you too. Lillian Young calmly disassociated herself. Sebastian Ward glanced at her indifferently, his gaze falling to the red stain on the floor, a provocative smile playing on his lips. Lillian Young's mind exploded, her face burning with embarrassment at the glaring red stain. Flustered and ashamed, she dragged the bewildered Hannah Doe towards the door. "Going somewhere?" Sebastian Ward taunted softly. "What, had your fill and now you want to run?" He, always serious, had never spoken so crudely to anyone, and was momentarily stunned. "You vile rogue, go to hell." Lillian Young, instead of anger, laughed. Her right hand extended, pulling the 7-colored tassel hanging by the door. In an instant, a fissure cracked across the wooden floor, splitting it in two to reveal a downward opening trapdoor. Sebastian Ward and Andy Bloom's faces paled drastically as they, along with the room's furnishings, plummeted into the abyss. "Darling, I'm innocent." Andy Bloom wailed in utter frustration, his foot landing on a round stool, using the momentum to leap upwards. "Ah!" A blood-curdling scream ripped through the air as Andy Bloom's handsome face received the imprint of a large boot. His body plummeted into the abyss. Sebastian Ward, using the momentum from his brutal kick, launched himself upwards towards Lillian Young, who perched above. Hannah Doe, brimming with misplaced enthusiasm, leaned forward, extending a hand. "Milord. Take Hannah Doe's hand. Hannah Doe will pull you up." Lillian Young's lips twitched, a warning directed at the intrusive Hannah Doe. "You dare try pulling him up, just you see." "But..." Miss, he. Hana-do, cowed by Lillian's glare, glanced anxiously downwards, slowly retracting her hand. "Milord, you're on your own. Hana-do can't save you." As Sebastian Ward drew nearer, Lillian Young calmly rubbed her hands together, preparing to knock him back down. Suddenly, Andy Bloom, consumed by a fiery rage, shot upwards from the chasm below, hot on Sebastian Ward's heels. His handsome face, still bearing the imprint of the boot, contorted in fury. A gentleman can be killed but not humiliated. This disfigurement is an unforgivable offense. I will not rest until I've had my revenge, or my reputation will be forever tarnished. Sebastian Ward, ignoring the enraged Andy, reached out and grabbed Lillian Young's right foot, using it to swing himself upwards. Unexpectedly, Andy Bloom, in his furious pursuit, caught up and wrapped his arms around Sebastian's legs. The combined weight of the two men pulled Lillian Young off balance. Her body tilted forward, her face paling with alarm. "Hana-do, hold me. Miss." Hana-do cried out, throwing her arms around Lillian's waist and pulling her back with all her might. A woman's strength was no match for a man's, let alone two large men. Their combined weight threatened to drag them all down. Hana-do's efforts were futile. Seeing their imminent fall, Sebastian Ward's eyes darkened. He released Lillian Young's foot, then, as she regained her balance, grabbed her again. A sharp ripping sound echoed through the air. Both Lillian Young and Sebastian Ward wore expressions of mortification as they stared at the tattered remnants of her skirt. The silk sash at her waist had snapped, leaving the entire lower garment dangling from Sebastian Ward's hand, revealing her long legs and the small, white, homemade undergarments trembling in the breeze. But that wasn't the worst of it. The love bites Sebastian Ward had left on her, scattered across her legs, were now on full display, a scandalous sight. A cool breeze swept past, and Lillian's mind reeled. Andy Bloom, dangling from Sebastian Ward's back, his eyes gleaming with excitement, 2 streams of blood trickling from his nose, offered a lewd compliment. "What a glorious view! I'd gladly die a happy ghost for such a sight." "That's not for your eyes. Die." Enraged by Andy Bloom's words, Sebastian Ward delivered a swift kick to his face, sending him plummeting back into the abyss. "And that's not for your eyes. Die." Lillian Young, trembling with fury, kicked Sebastian Ward in the face, watching with satisfaction as he tumbled into the chasm, his face etched with surprise. After a moment, her anger subsided. She pulled the tassel, closing the floor panel. Hana-do, her mouth still agape in astonishment, asked anxiously, "Miss, will they die?" "No, there's a deep pool at the bottom. They won't die, though they might turn into bloated toads. Now stop gawking and take off your coat. We need to get back to Brighton City before sunset. I have a score to settle with Venomous Touch. This time, I'll skin the whole lot of them, or I'll become a vegetarian." Lillian Young spoke as she began removing Hana-do's coat herself. "What do you mean, what am I supposed to do now?" Lillian Young asked, perplexed. My clothes," Hana-do wailed, near tears. "Oh." Lillian Young's understanding dawned. She nodded, yanked down a curtain from the window, and tossed it to Hana-do. "Wrap this around yourself." Hana-do caught the curtain, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Just this?" "Yes, Hana-do, hurry up. The sun will set in another hour. Western Hills is dangerous after dark, teeming with wolves and tigers like stars in the sky. If you don't want to become their supper, move it." Lillian Young leaned out the window, her tone laced with regret. "My top-grade sandalwood furniture is ruined. Replacing it will cost 1,000 taels, and who knows if the carver is even still alive." Wrapped in a curtain, Hana-do joined Lillian Young at the window, peering down anxiously. "I wonder if the groom is all right. I hope he hasn't gone daft," she murmured. "Entirely possible. Lillian Young fumed inwardly. The daft cow, couldn't she even tell who her mistress was? What had Sebastian Ward done for Hannah Doe to earn such loyalty? This wouldn't do. This unhealthy infatuation needed to be nipped in the bud. A sly smile curved her lips. There's a massive boulder in that ravine. If they were lucky enough not to land in the water, they're likely smashed to bits by now. Let's wish them luck, preferably the kind that keeps them out of the ravine. Right, let's go. Her ploy had worked perfectly. Observing Hannah Doe's stunned silence and gaping mouth, Lillian Young's spirits soared as she swept out of the small tower. Trailing half a step behind, Hannah Doe shivered, watching her mistress's triumphant back. Devil, she muttered under her breath. Chapter 23, brutally excessive. The two arrived back in Brighton City before nightfall. Once inside the city walls, Lillian Young led Hannah Doe to Snow Aroma Pavilion. The pavilion was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Outwardly, it was a high-end embroidery shop, staffed by a dozen or so seamstresses, each as lovely as a fairy, whose skills were renowned throughout the land. They catered exclusively to the wealthy, creating bespoke screens and silks, with limited edition pieces requiring advance orders. In reality, it was the editorial office of the Gentleman's Gazette. Every illustration and manuscript originated here, and the seamstresses took a few days off each month to manage the printing process. 2 strings of lanterns hung before the pavilion, all brightly lit except for the first lantern on the right string. Lillian Young knew this signaled that everyone had returned except for her. Their efficiency pleased her. They deserved a raise this month. Lillian Young nodded in satisfaction and knocked with a specific rhythm, 3 heavy raps, 2 light, their secret code to avoid unwanted attention from the authorities. The door creaked open, and a young woman in red emerged. Seeing Lillian Young, she paused, asking cautiously, "Can I help you, miss?" "Oh, so it's the new honey girl. Please, come in." Before Lillian Young could reply, the woman in red spotted Hannah Doe behind her and smiled in understanding. "Please, both of you, come in. This tiresome misconception." Lillian Young smiled wryly, choosing not to correct her. She followed the woman inside. Hannah Doe, trailing behind, clarified, "Helen, she's not a honey girl. She's the mistress." "Boss?" Helen gasped, holding a lantern on the stairs, turning to look at the completely unfamiliar face. A moment later, she nodded, still frightened. "So that's it. This face is very well made, completely flawless, even more exquisite than Celestial Peak's craftsmanship. Boss, why did you change your face? I'll explain this to you later. Are they all here?" Lillian Young didn't want to talk about being tricked. The corner of her mouth twitched a few times as she followed Helen, who was holding the lantern, upstairs. Helen answered while leading the way, "Everyone's back, only the boss was missing. The submitted paintings and manuscripts have been screened, and the excellent works have been selected. After the boss reviews and revises them, they can be sent for mass publication in time for the release date." "That's right, I almost forgot about this," Helen said excitedly. "Young Master Southwood from Painting Stew came by a few days ago." "Neil Southwood?" Lillian Young frowned. "What did he come for? What else could it be? He saw our flourishing business and wanted to cooperate with the boss." Helen leaned in mysteriously and whispered in her ear, "When he didn't see the boss, young Master Southwood looked like he'd lost his soul. I think he didn't come to discuss business, but clearly to discuss romance. If the boss had really been there, maybe a betrothal gift would have been delivered to the manor by now." "Helen, are you very idle? Your gossip spirit is sky high. Or should you switch jobs with Celestial Peak next month?" Lillian Young poked the gossiping Helen with her index finger, her smile carrying a hint of disciplinary pressure. Helen immediately retracted her smile and transformed into a dedicated and professional employee, shaking her head and rejecting her suggestion. "Boss, Helen really likes her current job. I lack talent excavation skills and am not suitable for exchanging jobs with Celestial Peak. Moreover, the key point is, Celestial Peak doesn't know how to embroider. Bang, bang, bang. Suddenly, a rapid knocking came from downstairs, interrupting their conversation. The three of them exchanged wary glances, their expressions changing. Recently, they had exposed too many things and offended quite a few enemies. Being chased with knives wasn't anything new. Lillian Young remained silent for a moment. The knocking continued, growing stronger and stronger, as if trying to smash the door. Who is it? The door will break if you keep knocking. Helen suppressed her anger, glared downstairs, and raised her lantern, about to go down. Lillian Young stopped her, signaling for silence, and whispered, "Don't go down yet, go upstairs." But Helen was very worried, afraid that the person would really break the door, and then it would be very troublesome to find someone to fix it. It's okay, let Venomous Gale handle it. If it's an enemy, give him a handful of poison powder. Let's go. Lillian Young looked downstairs suspiciously, a flicker of unease in her chest, sensing trouble at the door. She pushed Helen upstairs. "Miss Young, is Miss Young back yet?" Before the three of them could set foot on the ground, an urgent voice called from outside the door, a very familiar voice. "What is he doing here?" Lillian Young frowned. "Helen, tell him I'm away, for at least a month, maybe 3 or 5 years. This. Boss, aren't you planning to get married?" Helen pleaded earnestly, "Boss, you're 22 years old this year, already past your prime. The matter of marriage can't be delayed. I think he's not bad, and his family background is good. Why don't you consider it? Consider my arse, you pampered dandy, you can't even carry your own weight, you need servants to dress you, should I marry you just to dress you, hand you toilet paper in the privy? Get out, or I'll pack you up and deliver you to his bed myself." If it weren't for the people waiting outside, Lillian Young would have truly unleashed a torrent of fury. A tremendous crash echoed from downstairs, shaking the small house to its foundations. Lillian Young and Helen, faces grim, stormed downstairs, their fury and murderous intent palpable. Destroying personal property, a crime. Deserving death. Careful, young master, there's killing intent. A warning came from the shadows below, followed by a sudden light. Two small hands, moving with lightning-fast thunderbolt strikes, seized the white-clad young gentleman. The young servant who had shielded him was already sent sprawling, rolling across the floor. "Pay up!" Two furious roars erupted, making the wincing, white-clad gentleman clap his hands over his ears. Lillian Young and Helen tightened their grip, eliciting a pathetic wail from the young gentleman, "Ow, ow, ow. Gently, please, it hurts, my bones are breaking." Seeing the situation turn sour, the small servant quickly untied the money pouch from his belt. Rolling on the floor like a lazy donkey, he scrambled to the trio and respectfully presented the pouch with both hands. "Spare me, miss." "Humph." Helen scoffed, her slender fingers snatching the pouch and untying the string to check the contents. Satisfied with the amount, she nodded to Lillian Young, signaling that the compensation was sufficient. Lillian Young finally released her hold and stepped aside, casting a disdainful glance at the tearful Nhieu Southwood. It wasn't even close to a fracture. Such weeping from a grown man, she found him utterly pathetic and unsightly. Nhieu Southwood, with his handsome, scholarly features, was the weak, bookish type, probably only suited for a spectral maiden like Nia Xiaoqian. And yet, he possessed such a volatile temperament. In the 21st century, he'd be nothing more than a spoiled rich kid, living off his parents' wealth. She absolutely couldn't stand him. Ignoring her disdain, Nhieu Southwood dabbed his tears with a handkerchief, turned, and grasped Helen's shoulders, asking, "Is she back? Is she back yet?" Who's back?" Helen feigned ignorance, glancing at Lillian Young, unsure how to respond. "Miss Young, your boss, Lillian Young." Neil Southwood was agitated. I heard she's returned, just arrived in Brighton City. His information network was quite efficient. Lillian Young couldn't help but admire Neil Southwood's connections. Despite being a pampered dandy, he was remarkably well connected, from nobles and officials to the common folk, he knew them all. Chapter 24, Pure Bluff. Lillian Young winked at Helen, signaling her to follow their prearranged story. Helen, understanding the cue, smiled regretfully and said, "Unfortunately, Master Southwood, you've arrived a step too late. Our boss recently encountered some trouble, took a few things, and left, saying she was going on a long journey to avoid the issue." Left? Neil Southwood's eyes widened in disbelief. Did she say where she was going? I'm afraid not. She left in a great hurry, with no time for explanations. However, if you were to give chase now, you might still catch up. Helen lied without blinking, her deceitful smile giving Lillian Young goosebumps. Truly? Neil Southwood startled, turning around and leaving a sentence, "I'll go after her." In the blink of an eye, he ran out of the Snow Aroma Pavilion. At this moment, Hannah Doe chased him to the door, shouting at Neil Southwood, "Don't chase her, our mistress is married, she's hiding from the old master. This girl's got a loose tongue." Lillian Young, both amused and exasperated, stepped forward and knocked on Hannah Doe's head. However, Hannah Doe's words had a somewhat positive effect. For example, a blow straight to the head, shattering someone's heart. Watching the hurriedly running white figure suddenly stop 10 paces away, remaining motionless for a long time, Lillian Young was still very worried, afraid he couldn't bear it and would collapse and die. Is he still alive? She couldn't help but ask. The servant, frightened by his young master, grabbed Neil Southwood's leg and wailed, "Young master, say something." After hearing this sorrowful scene, Helen looked fearfully towards Lillian Young. Will anything happen? Let's go see. For conscience's sake, Lillian Young had to step forward, the other two following closely behind. Just as she reached Neil Southwood's back, Lillian Young was suddenly embraced by him, his mouth rambling, why is it like this? I waited for you for 12 years, since you were 10 and pulled my trousers. I was determined not to marry anyone but you, no, to not take anyone but you. But, what's going on? Why did I pull his trousers? That's absurd. Lillian Young tried to recall and recall again, but still couldn't remember such a thing. Then her mind flashed, and she remembered that 12 years ago, she hadn't yet transmigrated and occupied this body. TCH, the previous self was truly a little tyrant, even daring to pull a boy's trousers. Just a casual question, why did you pull his trousers? She was very curious about this. Neil Southwood glanced at her, angrily saying, "Are you stupid? Of course, it was to stuff bugs into my trousers. Isn't this something to be ashamed of? Why did he say it with such a righteous expression?" Lillian Young was stunned. They say women are made of water, this saying is truly nonsense. Neil Southwood cried even more than a woman, tears pouring out like a river, flowing without holding back, crying for a full half-hour before finally letting go of Lillian Young, this involuntary listener. Watching the disconsolate Neil Southwood being dragged away by his servants, don't doubt it, he was really being dragged, probably because he cried too much, his body was dehydrated, and he was exhausted. The three simultaneously breathed a sigh of relief, rubbing their aching ears, looking at each other, speechless for a long time. Lillian Young's chest was soaked, a light squeeze could wring out half a basin of water, her face darkened, her clenched fists trembling as they relaxed. Damn it, she almost punched that crybaby Neil Southwood. Everyone go back. Lillian Young, now like a released spring, wearily turned and walked into the Snow Aroma Pavilion. Helen, the lamplighting servant girl, wiped the cold sweat, her face still filled with terror, tremblingly following behind, the lingering cries still echoing in her ears. Hannah Doe, walking behind, slowly closed her mouth, silently following, secretly relieved in her heart, thankfully her mistress's husband wasn't Neil Southwood, the groom who fell into the abyss, although cold, was still 100 times better than that crybaby. She wondered if the groom was still alive. The three returned to Snow Aroma Pavilion, pushing open the door to the brightly lit meeting room, only to find it deserted. Looking at the empty room, the scattered papers, the crumpled outerwear, and the small mountain of melon seed shells, Lillian Young's face twitched, suppressing her anger. Whack. The first sound was crisp and decisive, the second dull and pained. Lillian Young, eyes watering, retracted her right hand from where it had struck the table, bringing it to her mouth to blow on it gently. This didn't alleviate the pain, so she simply shook her hand behind her back, her expression remaining unchanged. What's going on? Where is everyone? Helen, as if just remembering something, sheepishly rubbed the tip of her nose. I forgot to tell you, ma'am. They all had business today and went out. It's just me minding the shop. Everyone's out. A rare occurrence. Lillian Young was suspicious. Where did they go? Ah! Helen exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. Ma'am! Congratulations! Congratulations on what? Could it be that these people all knew about the stand-in situation? Lillian Young felt a twinge of guilt, forcing a smile. Helen's eyes widened in surprise. Don't you know, ma'am? Tonight is your brother's wedding. The ceremony is probably happening right now. You should hurry back, you might still catch it. Oh, I've already chosen a gift for you. I'll go get it. With that, Helen turned and went out, returning shortly with a small, dark red wooden chest. She thrust it into Lillian Young's hands, urging her, go quickly. I'll stay and watch the shop. What was going on? Her elder brother was getting married. To whom? Lillian Young's mind was in a daze, completely blank. By the time she came to her senses, Helen had already pushed her out of the pavilion. Hannah Doe, visibly excited, took the chest from her, grinning. Double happiness. Master will be overjoyed. Miss, let's hurry back to the estate for the ceremony. Yeah. Lillian Young uttered two noncommittal syllables, suppressing her surprise and confusion. She swiftly traversed the rooftops, making her way back to Young Estate. Before they even entered the estate, they were enveloped in a sea of festive light. Outside Young Estate, carriages lined up like a flowing river, and guests thronged like weaving shuttles, nearly trampling the doorstep. Congratulations echoed endlessly, accompanied by a lavish display of gifts. Miss, the young master is really getting married. Hannah Doe gulped. Lillian Young nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on an unfortunate target. She beckoned Hannah Doe closer and whispered, Go, lead him to that small alley over there. Hannah Doe, puzzled, looked at the designated target. Why? I need to borrow something from him. Hurry. Having given her instructions, Lillian Young took a step ahead, concealing herself in the dimly lit alley, waiting for Hannah Doe to bring the man over. My lady, why have you brought me to this place? The scholar's refined tone held a hint of sourness, causing Lillian Young to frown. She slowly emerged from the shadows, ear-picking, coming face to face with the lead scholar. You are, the scholar looked at her in surprise, clearly recognizing her. However, before he could finish speaking, Lillian Young knocked him unconscious with a single chop. Hannah Doe, worried, followed closely behind. After carefully checking the scholar and confirming he was unharmed, she breathed a sigh of relief, asking with a hint of reproach, Miss, why did you knock Scholar Jean unconscious? Miss, you're under the influence of the love poison again. Hannah Doe stared in astonishment as her mistress swiftly undressed Scholar Jean. A chilling thought about the love poison struck her, her face flushing crimson. Stammering, she said, Miss, people occasionally pass by here. It's better to bring him inside the manor. I'll keep watch for you. Hashtag Chapter 25, Remorse and Fear of Exposure. Lillian Young offered no lengthy explanation, quickly stripping Scholar Zhang and then beginning to remove her own clothes to exchange with his. Unexpectedly, a blushing Hannah Do rushed forward, gripping her hand mid-undressing, shaking her head. Don't undress. Wait until we're back in your chambers. Hannah Do, what are you thinking? Seeing Hannah Do's unusual blush and connecting it with her words, Lillian Young's mind flashed with understanding. She instantly realized Hannah Do had misinterpreted her intentions, thinking she meant to engage in intimacy with the scholar. Her face flushed crimson, then paled, finally settling on a furious black. You perverse girl, your mind is filled with filth. Let go of me. We'll miss the ceremony. Hannah Do stubbornly shook her head. I won't let go. Don't be silly. I'm just borrowing his clothes for a bit. Lillian Young, unsure whether to be touched or exasperated, looked at Hannah Do with a mixture of emotions. Hannah Do, still caught in her misapprehension, blushed even deeper, withdrawing her hand and shrinking to the side, berating herself. Only after Lillian Young had finished changing, and had settled Scholar Zhang, did they slip into Young Estate together. Hannah Do hadn't disguised herself, and everyone at Young Estate knew her. Lillian Young could only act independently. She instructed Hannah Do to return to the manor, find the third young mistress, and, when no one was looking, abduct her to the Snow Aroma Pavilion. She was to return later and help Lillian remove the human skin mask. Lillian Young hurried into the estate, arriving just as the newlyweds were performing their wedding bows. She saw her father, his face flushed with joy, seated high in the hall, beside her mother, who had been away for many years. He must have been overjoyed. Lillian Young blended into the crowd of guests, watching her elder brother, Jasper Young, his face radiant with happiness. His hands grasped the red silk ribbons, the other ends tied to the woman of his dreams. Amidst the officiant's calls and the blessings of family and friends, they bowed to heaven and earth. This similar scene brought back the humiliating memory of the trap she had fallen into earlier that day. Without teaching them a lesson, the resentment in her heart would be hard to quell. The peanuts she had conveniently pocketed earlier now had a purpose. Whoosh, whoosh, 2 peanuts found their marks, striking the bride's legs, causing her to stumble and fall. Ah, eldest brother Young! The bride cried out, her body swaying, her red veil lifting to reveal the lower half of her face. How familiar that voice sounded. Before she could ponder it, Lillian Young saw Jasper Young swiftly catch the bride in his arms, readjusting her veil. Are you all right? Her father wiped away cold sweat, cautiously glancing at her mother. Seeing she wasn't angry, he breathed a sigh of relief and said with a smile, Jasper, quickly escort your bride down. Do your best in the consummation chamber. Next year, I want to hold my eldest grandson. Your mother is also looking forward to it. Isn't that right, my wife? Her mother paid no attention to her father. Her gaze rested on Lillian in her disguise, causing her father to scowl at her in displeasure, making Lillian's heart nearly skip a beat. Honestly, father, even when jealous, he couldn't look straight. But mother's gaze was sharp, she must have recognized her. Lillian Young, startled and fearing exposure, stuck out her tongue and lowered her head to avoid her mother's gaze, then followed the boisterous group of talented young men. Her elder brother's mischievous friends, never ones to shy away from revelry, dragged him away, finding every excuse to ply him with drinks. Lillian Young was also pressured into drinking a couple of cups, but thankfully, her tolerance was high, so she remained relatively sober. Glancing at her thoroughly inebriated brother, Lillian Young excused herself to use the privy, then stealthily slipped into his courtyard, seizing the opportunity to sneak into the bridal chamber and investigate the new bride's identity. The new sister-in-law intrigued her, she felt she had encountered her somewhere before, a nagging sense of familiarity. With considerable effort, Lillian Young managed to acquire a servant's outfit and, using the commotion as cover, infiltrated the bridal chamber, intending to render her sister-in-law unconscious to see her true face. Unexpectedly, chaotic footsteps and a clamor erupted outside, forcing her to quickly leap onto a rafter to hide. Just as she concealed herself, the door burst open, and a throng of people surged in, commencing the boisterous wedding night rituals. Most were her brother's close friends, along with some business associates, usually serious men, now unleashed and devising all sorts of mischievous pranks to tease her brother. Seeing him nearly stripped bare, down to his undergarments, she stifled her laughter, barely daring to breathe. Then, their father arrived, managing to pacify the crowd and leave the newlyweds in peace to consummate their marriage. This young chap, usually not one for such nervousness or formality, now resembled a love-struck schoolboy, his face flushed as he approached the bed, softly calling out, "My wife," and with trembling hands, lifted the veil. Lillian Young, a mixture of disdain and anticipation, held her breath, waiting to see the face beneath the veil. Unfortunately, the bride was obscured by the curtains. She remained patient, knowing they would soon partake in the ceremonial wine and food, revealing the bride's face then. Come to think of it, she and Sebastian Ward hadn't even shared the ceremonial wine during their own wedding night. Ah, what was she thinking, longing for such a ritual with that scoundrel? No, focus. Slapping herself, Lillian Young finally regained some composure, the heat in her face subsiding. Downstairs, her brother escorted his bride to the table, but due to the angle, the bride was hidden by his tall, slender frame. Lillian Young was burning with impatience. When Jasper Young finally shifted, the bride's true face was revealed. That radiant, smiling countenance struck Lillian Young like a bolt from the blue. She desperately wished for a gust of wind to extinguish all the candles in the room, just so she wouldn't have to see that face. Why her? Her sister-in-law was her. What was happening? Could someone please explain? Beyond stunned silence, she couldn't muster any appropriate reaction. Charlotte Trent. Her sister-in-law was Charlotte Trent, the woman who had impersonated her and taken her place at the wedding. Was it April Fool's Day? Was the universe playing a cruel joke on her? Elder brother Young. Hush, little fool. You should change your form of address now. Ha. Call me husband or my lord. From this day forward, we are husband and wife, destined to grow old together. Chills ran down Lillian Young's spine, wave after wave of goosebumps erupting across her skin. Could it get any more repulsive? Couldn't he at least consider her feelings, the wretched brother? Young, my husband, is this truly all right? Charlotte Trent fretted, a flicker of reluctance in her eyes. Don't you worry, Duke Clarence is a good man. Our little sister won't suffer marrying him. Jasper Young soothed his young wife, his voice low. Jasper Young, you heartless dog. You'd scheme against your own sister for your own happiness. Where's my knife? Blast it, not the time. We'll settle this later. Humph. Lillian Young seethed, her eyes blazing at Jasper Young, her mind racing with vengeful plots. Jasper Young shivered, prompting a concerned Charlotte Trent to ask, "What's wrong?" A bit of a chill. Achoo, achoo. What's this? Why's it gone quiet? The room fell silent, the candlelight dimming slightly. Lillian Young glanced down, her face flushing crimson in an instant, her mouth opening in a silent curse. These two are far too eager. The bed's right there. Couldn't they have waited a bit? The air in the room grew thick with desire. The newlyweds began with a kiss, shedding their clothes, then reaching a point of restriction, leaving Lillian Young, perched on the rafters, in a predicament. If I bolt now, I'll certainly disturb them. And if I'm not careful, my brother might be frightened into impotence, jeopardizing the Young's lineage. Grandfather would surely kill me in his rage. I suppose I'll just endure it. She wanted to weep, but no tears came. Hashtag chapter 26, Bloody Hell. That was terrifying. Husband, sister-in-law, have mercy. This maiden is still young and easily tempted. This is torture. Below is a scene of unbridled passion. I can't, and won't, watch, yet I'm tormented by their gasps. I'll surely be feverish tomorrow. Lillian Young weighed her options, finally settling on a solution. With a determined glint, she raised 2 fingers, bit her lip, and pressed them against her pressure points, settling down on the rafters to meet the Sandman. The next morning, Lillian Young awoke with dark circles under her eyes. Thankfully, she'd slept soundly and hadn't fallen from the rafters. The couple in the room had already left to pay their respects to their parents. Time for a quick escape. As soon as she left the Young estate, Hannah Doe rushed over, embracing her tightly. Miss, where did you go? There. Urgent business. Didn't have time to tell. You. Lillian Young patted Hannah Doe's head reassuringly, stifling a yawn. Come on, let's get breakfast. We'll talk later. Yes, miss. Hannah Doe nodded obediently. The usual beef buns from Sina's? Yes, their buns are quite good, and the porridge is delicious. Lillian Young nodded, heading off in a familiar direction. The morning air in Brighton City was still quiet. Steam rose from the breakfast stalls, creating a scene that resembled a mystical wonderland from afar. The two made their way to Sina's bun shop, choosing their usual spot by the window, ordering 2 bowls of porridge, 6 buns, and a side of pickled vegetables. Miss, someone across from us is staring. Hannah Doe shielded half her face with her large bowl, winking at her mistress across the table. Lillian Young paused, turning to look behind her. A single glance revealed the person Hannah Doe had mentioned. Not far from them, separated by a family enjoying their meal, sat a figure in a wide-brimmed hat that concealed their face. Judging by their build, it was a man, quite imposing, flanked by 2 retainers with swords at their hips, clearly trained in martial arts. The man radiated a dangerous aura, making her uneasy. Eat quickly, and then we leave, Lillian Young said flatly, returning to her porridge without a hint of tension or unusual behavior. They finished their breakfast quickly, placed their silver on the table, and left. Barely 3 steps outside, the proprietress hurried after them, holding the small silver coins they'd left, smiling. A gentleman has already paid for your steamed buns. Paid? Who paid? Before Lillian Young could ask, the man from earlier emerged from the eatery with his retinue. He approached her and said in a low voice, "Follow me." Bloody hell, how terrifying. Could this man be? Lillian Young's face paled. She stumbled back 3 steps, pulling Hannah Doe behind her. Run! Like startled rabbits, they scrambled onto the roof, leaping 2 or 3 times before vanishing. Your lordship, shall we pursue them? Hannah Doe, still dazed, heard voices and turned in surprise. A gust of wind snatched away the man's face covering, revealing a face marked with a crimson footprint. She stared, speechless with shock. Lillian Young dragged Hannah Doe back to the Snow Aroma Pavilion, collapsing at a table. Water, she gasped. I need water to calm my nerves. A cup of tea arrived promptly. Lillian Young drained it in one gulp, earning a reproach. The way you gulp tea like water is a criminal waste of good leaves. A graceful woman settled beside her, elegantly fanning herself. The cool breeze offered a welcome respite from the heat. Lillian Young looked at her gratefully, holding out her empty cup. Another, please. This time I'll savor it. Tell me, what happened? You look like you ran for your life. Did you encounter an enemy? The woman asked, taking the empty cup to refill it. Lillian Young's face was etched with distress. If only it were an enemy, she murmured. It's someone, complicated. Oh. And who might that be? Laughter drifted in from the doorway as a group of beautiful women entered, each finding a seat. Their gazes, however, remained fixed on Lillian. These gossipmongers wouldn't rest until they'd unearthed a juicy secret. Lillian Young considered how to recount her heroic tale of impersonation. "Miss, I've brought 3rd Mississippi." Hannah Doe entered with Sylvie Young, who carried a bowl of noodles. Hannah pulled up a chair for Sylvie beside Lillian. Slurp. The sound of noisy eating filled the air. Sylvie Young slurped her noodles, admiring her disguised face, occasionally poking and prodding it, treating Lillian Young's face like a plaything. The last of the hot noodles disappeared with a gulp. Sylvie Young stared at the empty bowl for a moment, then resolutely held it out. More. More noodles, more egg, more meat, more broth. You'll eat yourself to death one of these days. Or at least into a blimp. Lillian Young's face twitched. "Take that face off," she said sternly. "Immediately. Now." "Why?" "It's good. It suits me." Sylvie Young shook her head, tugging at the disguised face. "The feel, the thinness, it's just like my real skin. No one will ever know." "Is that so?" Lillian Young gave a strained laugh, feigning surprise. "I saw Jade Frost a few days ago, and he asked me to give you a message. Well, not just a message, he also said if I had any news of you to let him know, and even asked me to tie you up and wait for him to come and marry you." "Second sister, you wouldn't agree to that, would you?" Sylvie Young nodded firmly, her eyes narrowing in a smile. "What good could he possibly offer you?" "But, he could help me expand my business. Jade Frost is quite the catch, the sales certainly wouldn't be bad." Second sister, I'll help you restore your face right away." Sylvie Young anxiously pulled a blue porcelain jar from her bag, offering it with both hands, carefully explaining how to use it. "Pour hot water into a basin for a face soak, then apply this, and your facial skin will peel off like a mask. Of course, that face can still be used afterwards." "Alright, leave it here, you can go now." Lillian Young took the porcelain jar and waved her hand dismissively. "Can I wait until I've finished my noodles before leaving?" Sylvie Young asked timidly, her eyes filled with a pitiful expression. Lillian Young sighed and nodded, tapping her on the head in warning. "Don't tell anyone about my return to Snow Aroma Pavilion, otherwise." I know. Sylvie Young nodded repeatedly like a pecking chicken, brazenly suggesting, "Second sister, I want to stay here for a few months." "Thank you, second sister, you're the best." Her silence was taken as tacit agreement, and Sylvie Young went downstairs to wait for her noodles, relieved. Just as she left the room, she was called back. "Come back, I have something for you to do, consider it a condition for your stay at Snow Aroma Pavilion." "What is it?" Sylvie Young had a bad feeling, looking warily at her second sister. When it came to scheming, no one in the Young family could compare to her second sister. "Don't be nervous, it's nothing bad, just deliver a letter to our eldest brother for me. Of course, absolutely do not reveal your identity." Lillian Young quickly wrote the letter, placed it in a white envelope, and handed it to Sylvie Young, patting her shoulder. "This glorious and arduous task is entrusted to you, third young mistress. Don't disappoint the expectations of your second sister and the Snow Aroma Pavilion chef. Off you go. Second sister." Sylvie Young looked as if she was about to cry. Can someone else go? There are many sisters in Snow Aroma Pavilion, they won't miss me." Chapter 27, Failed Negotiation. No. The negotiation ultimately failed. Lillian Young smiled as she saw the dejected Sylvie Young off. This was the consequence of trying to scheme against her, no one could escape. Her revenge was terrifying. After nightfall, Lillian Young went alone to Fragrant Veranda Pavilion, ordered a pot of fine tea, and waited for Jasper Young to arrive as planned. She was in a very good mood tonight because someone was going to be unlucky, and her revenge would undoubtedly succeed. Touching the painting placed at her right hand, she smiled triumphantly, her beautiful phoenix eyes slightly raised, carrying a hint of charm and allure, captivating the waiter who came to serve the tea. "Miss, the guest you're waiting for has arrived. Do you need me to serve the dishes?" The waiter snapped out of his daze, stammering, his face flushed with embarrassment as he lowered his head, not daring to look up. Lillian Young nodded. "Let him in, serve the tea first, then the dishes." "I'll do it right away, miss, please wait a moment." The waiter hurriedly left, invited her guest into the private room, poured the tea, and then excused himself. Jasper Young, looking at his sister's restored face, seemed to understand something. "You've met the third young mistress." The child who delivered the letter today was the third young mistress. I was confused. Only she knows the bone-setting technique. Indeed, not foolish at all. Sit. Lillian Young nodded approvingly, pointing to the opposite seat. After he settled, she handed him the painting beside her, gesturing, "Open it and see." Jasper Young glanced at her suspiciously, slowly unfolding the painting. A single glance was enough to make him hastily fold it back, looking at her in astonishment. "This is..." "Don't doubt it, it's your sister-in-law." Lillian Young smiled mischievously, teasing, "Well, a perfect likeness, isn't it? My painting skills aren't bad, are they? Looking at this painting, surely you feel the stirrings of spring, the fires of desire." "Jasper, a young lady shouldn't speak such vulgar words." Jasper Young scolded angrily. "Damn it, I don't care if you live or die." Lillian Young slammed the table, making her choice clear. "Brother, don't blame me for being heartless. You played a part in scheming for me to be a substitute bride today. You know my temper. I never suffer a loss. If you scheme against me, you should know the consequences. Make up your mind. Between you and sister-in-law, choose one." "Choose?" Jasper Young's face paled. "Choose what? Explain clearly." "Very simple. Tomorrow at noon, run naked on Tower Street. You must act convincingly, or don't blame me for turning my back and hanging your sister-in-law's nude portrait on the East City Gate for all the world to admire. Weigh your options carefully. I hope you make the best choice, lest you regret it later." Lillian Young didn't beat around the bush, kindly reminding him, "Brother, a woman's reputation is a serious matter. I'm sure you've already made your decision. Oh dear, don't let sister-in-law regret marrying the wrong man." "Miss, excuse me." The waiter appeared at the right moment, breaking the tension. The two remained silent, waiting for the waiter to finish serving the food and withdraw. "You." Jasper Young's face turned green, glaring at his sister, wishing he could strangle her with his bare hands. Fortunately, he still had some sense left, restraining himself after a long while. Through gritted teeth, he roared, "Jasper, you're out of your mind. Brother, spare me the nonsense. You forced me to do this, don't blame me." Lillian Young calmly ate her food, lifting her head to say, "Now that you're here, finish your meal before you leave." "Eat?" He was already full from shock and anger. Jasper Young regretted everything. "Jasper, you've been rebellious since childhood, never listening to our parents. You left the Youngs to establish your own household, and at 20, you're not even worried about marriage. Look at the women your age, all married with children. I don't like hearing that." Lillian Young slammed her chopsticks down, angrily retorting, "There are plenty of women much older than me who aren't married. Not to mention, take Venomous Touch for example. She's 4 years older than me, and isn't she still single? Our eldest sister is different. You know that." Jasper Young's face darkened, unwilling to discuss the matter. Lillian Young fell silent, knowing she had overstepped, bringing up a painful subject for the Youngs. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, she sincerely apologized, "I'm sorry, brother. However, the matter of running naked is non-negotiable. I hope you'll prepare yourself mentally. Tomorrow at noon, I'll be waiting at the Idle Moon Tavern. I'll give you half an hour. If you don't come, you'll bear the consequences. As you wish. Jasper Young flung his sleeve and strode away. The following day, Lillian Young, accompanied by Hannah Doe disguised as Charlotte Trent, arrived at the Idle Moon Tavern half an hour early. They ordered a flask of azure blossom wine and a few pastries, then settled by a window. Lillian leaned against the frame, half her body extended outwards, gazing down at the street below. Hannah Doe sat beside her, eating. She found it odd that her mistress only drank wine and didn't touch the food, her gaze fixed on the street below as if something interesting was happening. Curious, Hannah leaned closer to the window, poking her head out for a better view. She saw nothing but the usual bustling crowd and hurrying carriages. "What are you looking at, miss?" Lillian Young took a sip of azure blossom wine and, instead of answering, asked, "Hannah Doe, what time is it now?" "Oh. It must be noon already." Hannah Doe craned her neck further, scrutinizing the street below once more, but still found nothing of interest. Finally, she shook her head and returned to the table to continue her meal. "Light it," Lillian Young said, frowning slightly, tossing the incense stick she'd been fiddling with to Hannah Doe. Hannah Doe took the incense, lit it, and placed it in the small censer they had brought. "Are you timing something, miss? Are you expecting someone? I'll show you something good in a moment." Lillian Young smiled mysteriously, withdrawing her gaze from the street below. She understood her elder brother and trusted he wouldn't disappoint. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd below. People parted on either side of the street, creating a narrow path. A lone rider approached on horseback, the figure unmistakably her elder brother. Lillian Young smiled with satisfaction, took another sip of wine, and turned to Hannah Doe. "Come here quickly, something interesting is about to happen." "Coming, coming." Hannah Doe stuffed her mouth full of food and widened her eyes, looking down. Pfft. Cough, 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 the rice she hadn't yet swallowed sprayed downwards. Hannah Doe's eyes widened, pointing at the approaching rider in astonishment. It's the young master." "I know." Lillian Young hopped onto the windowsill, a flask of wine in one hand and a cup in the other, sitting barefooted with an air of nonchalant grace. Her eyes followed the approaching figure, a smile playing on her lips. Her elegant posture as she drank was enough to make certain eyes burn with envy. Sebastian Ward, positioned directly opposite in another window, had a clear view of her. Those bare ankles were a blatant provocation. This woman, already married, dared to behave so brazenly. Lillian Young, however, saw only Jasper Young. At this moment, there was no room in her eyes for anyone else, oblivious to the smoldering gaze directed at her. Pfft! A mouthful of wine sprayed out. Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. Was that truly Jasper Young? What had happened to him? Jasper Young, stark naked, rode to a halt beneath the Idle Moon Tavern. He looked up, quickly locating his sister. He frowned at the sight of her bare feet. But that wasn't the main issue. The main issue was the shocking state of his face. His normally handsome face was now swollen and red, as if he had been attacked by a swarm of bees. Covered in welts the size of peas, he was almost unrecognizable. This must be his scheme. "Jasper Young, you are indeed formidable." Lillian Young admitted defeat. "Jasper, put your shoes on." True to form, even in this predicament, her elder brother didn't forget to chastise her about her appearance. Jasper Young, as if in defiance, stood motionless beneath the window like a bronze statue, his gaze fixed on her bare feet. Chapter 28, Have you played enough? All right, I concede. Hannah Doe, my shoes. Lillian Young shook her head in resignation and put on her shoes. Opposite her, Sebastian Ward's face was dark as he glared at Jasper Young. The crowd of onlookers grew, and a child pointed at Jasper Young, shouting, "Look, someone's not wearing any trousers. Hush, be quiet. He's not right in the head. Don't provoke him, or he might lash out. A nearby parent warned their child, giving Jasper Young a strange look. Jasper Young's face darkened instantly. He roared angrily towards the upper floor, "Jasper, behave yourself. Get back to your room and don't make a spectacle of yourself." With that, he bolted, swift as the wind, knocking over a string of onlookers and eliciting a chorus of curses. That's definitely it. Hannah-Do, who had been silent until now, nodded emphatically. Lillian Young was bewildered. What's definitely it? Miss, the eldest young master has definitely been poisoned by the eldest young mistress. It's called the Supreme Visage Elixir. The eldest young mistress had someone test it 3 months ago. Hannah-Do watched Jasper Young disappear into the distance with a sympathetic gaze. She'd heard this poison had no antidote, wasn't life-threatening, and would dissipate within a month. Such a disfigured face, the eldest young master having to endure it for a month, was a dreadful thought. Venomous touch again. She was partly responsible for this malicious act, and this vendetta needed settling. Lillian Young carefully considered how to punish Catherine Young, the first rule being to avoid close contact to prevent being poisoned herself. "Oh, my lord is alive." Hannah-Do looked at Sebastian Ward, speechless with joy. "What?" Lillian Young exclaimed in alarm. She looked up to see Sebastian Ward standing opposite her, his face grim, his eyes promising retribution. Her plan had backfired. She had intended to use Charlotte Trent to pressure her elder brother into obedience, but she had fallen into Sebastian Ward's hands instead. The bungled scheme mortified her. "Have you had enough amusement? It's time to return to the manor with me." Sebastian Ward looked at her calmly, his imposing presence making it hard for her to breathe. "Hannah-Do, time to prove your worth. Stall him." Lillian Young tumbled back into the room, sealed the window with pressure point techniques, and, taking advantage of the moment the window slammed shut, spun around and fled towards the back exit of the Leisure Moon Pavilion. As she vaulted over the back wall, she was met by rows of Duke's Manor guards. Seeing her emerge, they bowed respectfully. "We greet the Duchess. Please return to the manor." Lillian Young's eyes narrowed. She leaped back into the courtyard and headed for the front entrance, only to be intercepted by Sebastian Ward. A flash of movement, a wall of muscle before her, and before she could react, she was in his familiar embrace, held firmly yet gently, unable to escape. "It's time to go home." Sebastian Ward's voice was gentle, devoid of reproach. His actions, however, told a different story. With a swift move, he sealed 2 of her pressure points, rendering her immobile and speechless. She could only watch helplessly as he carried her away. This man was truly two-faced. The fish was hooked, it was time to reel it in. Sebastian Ward carried her into the palanquin and departed with a formidable escort of Duke's Manor guards. Hannah-Do chased after them. "My lord, wait for Hannah-Do." "Blast it all." Lillian Young glared, but her anger evaporated like mist upon meeting Sebastian Ward's gaze, rendering her outburst utterly ineffectual. Upon returning to the Duke's Manor, Sebastian Ward promptly deposited her in the bridal chamber. The decorations from the previous day remained, vibrant red double happiness symbols adorned the room, auspicious fruits were still meticulously arranged, and even the dragon and phoenix candles lit during the ceremony had yet to fully burn down. Did he intend to reenact the wedding night? A flicker of alarm crossed Lillian Young's face as she watched him warily. Unfazed, Sebastian Ward proceeded to the table, poured 2 cups of wine, offered one to her, and kept the other for himself. "The nuptial cup," he stated, "I need you for this." "Can I not drink it?" Lillian Young inquired, a hint of resentment in her voice. "What do you think?" Sebastian Ward reached across, took her hand holding the cup, and drained its contents in a single draught. Left with little choice, she reluctantly followed suit, emptying her own cup with a touch of defiance. The wine was consumed. Was the consummation next? Lillian Young's tension mounted, her face flushing crimson as she sought an escape. She waited, anticipating the extinguishing of the candles, the arrival of the wolf, but after setting down his cup, Sebastian Ward simply said, "Sleep well," and turned to leave. "Keep watch over the Duchess. She is not to leave," he instructed with a sly expression, his intent to confine her clear, infuriating Lillian Young. Hannah Doe arrived later, dispatched by Sebastian Ward to attend her. He also assigned 2 maids from the Duke's manor, both wearing distinctive belts that, without a doubt, concealed flexible swords. Ostensibly there to serve, they were clearly also meant to monitor and restrict her movements. What a charade! Lillian Young glanced at the newly assigned maids, scoffed disdainfully, and instructed Hannah Doe to prepare her for bed. Upon waking, attendants dressed and adorned her, then escorted her to a nearby room for breakfast. Sebastian Ward was already seated at the table. He nodded for the servants to withdraw as she entered and served her a bowl of porridge. "Come and eat." "I don't want porridge. I want steamed buns, Nhieu family buns, and their pickled vegetables," Lillian Young retorted, seizing the opportunity to provoke him. Unperturbed, Sebastian Ward placed the porridge before her and proceeded to eat his own breakfast. He finished without a glance in her direction and departed. Watching his rather dashing retreat, Lillian Young gritted her teeth, rubbing her stomach in frustration. "Humph, so inconsiderate. I'll leave you sooner or later." Unable to genuinely stomach starvation, she faced the spread of buns, thin porridge, and delicate side dishes and ate heartily. After 2 bowls of porridge, she realized the Duke's chef was quite skilled, each dish possessed a unique flavor she had never encountered. Just as she finished, setting down her utensils and wiping her mouth, Sebastian Ward returned, carrying a basket which he placed before her. "Here are the breakfast items you requested." He then arranged the contents on the table, 3 large steamed buns, a plate of pickled vegetables, and a bowl of vegetable porridge.